I worked for 7 grueling years closing billion-dollar deals in Japan for my family investment firm. Then they fired me right before my biggest contract signing, claiming a $50 software could replace me anytime. I smiled and walked away. The day of the actual signing will be unforgettable. My name is Samantha, 33 years old, and I was the Director of Mergers and Acquisitions for the Asia-Pacific region at my family-owned investment firm. Or at least I was until a Tuesday morning that changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your true worth. You are fired, Samantha. Pack your desk and be out of this building in 15 minutes. And do not even think about asking for that $5 million commission from the Takahashi deal, because the company is signing that contract, not you. The thick manila envelope slid across the polished mahogany table of our 40th floor Manhattan boardroom, stopping right in front of my hands. I looked up. Standing on the other side of the glass table was my brother-in-law, Trayvon. At 38 years old, Trayvon was a tall, imposing African-American man who had just been handed the position of Chief Operating Officer. He adjusted his custom silk tie, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He had always been a ruthless pragmatist, a man who believed that loud voices and aggressive American corporate tactics could bully any international partner into submission. He despised the careful, culturally nuanced approach I used in the Asian markets. Beside him stood my older sister Stephanie. She was 36, freshly appointed as the chief executive officer by our parents, despite having absolutely zero experience closing international mergers. Stephanie crossed her arms over her designer blazer, looking down at me with a look of pure contempt. "We have decided to take over the Sakura project," Stephanie announced, her tone dripping with unearned authority. "The $1.5 billion merger with the Takahashi Corporation is entering its final stage. We do not need a glorified translator sitting at the big kids' table anymore." A glorified translator. The words hit the air like a physical strike. I had spent 2 agonizing years cultivating this deal. 2 years of flying back and forth between New York and Tokyo. 2 years of navigating the intricate, highly traditional corporate culture of Mr. Kenji Takahashi, a 60-year-old Japanese tech billionaire who valued honor, respect, and deep personal trust above all financial metrics. I was the one who sat through the endless tea ceremonies. I was the one who translated the complex legal nuances. I was the one who earned his trust. Stephanie had never even met the man. She had barely managed to point out Tokyo on a map. I looked back and forth between them, keeping my breathing completely steady. "I built this deal from the ground up," I said calmly. "My degree in East Asian languages and cultures is the only reason Mr. Takahashi even opened the door for this firm. You both know he refuses to do business with anyone who disrespects his heritage." Stephanie rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, Samantha, stop pretending your little cultural studies degree makes you special. Mom and Dad always said you wasted your college years on a useless major instead of studying finance like I did. You are just a translation tool, a highly overpaid human dictionary." Trayvon chuckled, resting his heavy hands on the table. He leaned forward, his expensive cologne filling the space between us. "Welcome to the modern world, Samantha," he sneered. "We just purchased a premium artificial intelligence translation software for $50 a month. It can translate complex legal documents in 3 seconds flat. We do not need to pay you a $5 million commission when an algorithm can do your job for the price of a decent lunch. Besides, business is just numbers. Once we get to Tokyo and flash American dollars in his face, that old man will sign on the dotted line." I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not beg for my job or my commission. I simply looked at Trayvon's self-satisfied face and Stephanie's greedy eyes, and a wave of absolute cold clarity washed over me. They were arrogant. They were greedy. And most dangerously, they were deeply, incredibly ignorant. They thought a $50 software could replace 7 years of cultural trust. They thought they could bully a traditional Japanese billionaire who valued loyalty over profit. But more importantly, they did not know the one secret I had carefully secured. Mr. Takahashi had never signed a standard letter of intent with our company. Because of his strict traditional values and the personal bond we had forged, he had insisted on signing a specialized memorandum of understanding. That document contained an ironclad key personnel clause. It explicitly stated that the $1.5 billion deal was entirely contingent on my personal management of the project. Without my signature of approval, their massive, glorious contract was absolutely worthless, but I was not about to tell them that. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Two large security guards stepped into the room, their expressions blank and professional. Traven gestured toward them dismissively. "I told you, Samantha. 15 minutes. Give us your company key card and your corporate credit card right now. You are done here." I stood up slowly. I unclipped my company badge and set it gently on the mahogany table, right next to the termination envelope. I looked at my sister, whose eyes were shining with the petty victory she had craved since childhood, finally kicking the family scapegoat to the curb. Then I looked at Trayvon, who was already eagerly pulling up the Takahashi project files on the master screen. "Good luck in Tokyo, Trayvon," I said, keeping my voice smooth and pleasant. "I hope your $50 software knows how to properly execute a 45-degree bow." I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom with the security guards trailing closely behind me. By the time I reached my desk in the executive suite, my computer monitor had already gone entirely black. They had severed my network access while I was still standing in the meeting. I packed my personal belongings into a single cardboard box. A few framed photos, my favorite ceramic mug, and a traditional Japanese good luck charm Mr. Takahashi had gifted me during our first successful negotiation. The entire floor was silent. My former colleagues kept their heads down, staring intensely at their keyboards, too afraid of the new chief executive officer to offer even a whisper of goodbye. I carried my box toward the elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I was officially unemployed. I was stripped of a $5 million commission. My own flesh and blood had just betrayed me in the most humiliating way possible. Yet as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing me off from the company I had spent my entire 20s building, I could not stop the massive, genuine smile spreading across my face. They thought they had won. They thought they had buried me. They had no idea they had just set their own empire on fire. I stepped out of the brass elevators and into the cavernous marble lobby of the building my family owned. The midday Manhattan sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, harsh shadows across the polished floor. Business professionals rushed past me in their tailored suits, completely oblivious to the woman standing frozen with a cardboard box in her hands. I found a quiet corner near the security desk, set my box down on a cold stone bench, and pulled out my phone. I took a deep breath. Despite the humiliating spectacle in the boardroom, a small, foolish part of me still believed my parents would intervene. They were the founders of this firm. They had to understand the catastrophic financial risk of replacing a seasoned merger and acquisition director with a cheap translation app. They had to know Trayvon was jeopardizing a $1.5 billion deal purely out of ego. I dialed my father. Richard picked up on the second ring. "Dad," I began, keeping my voice tightly controlled. "Stephanie and Trayvon just ambushed me in the boardroom. They had security escort me out. They are trying to take over the Takahashi merger. You have to stop them before they destroy the entire relationship we have built over the last 2 years." There was no gasp of shock on the other end of the line. There was no fatherly concern. Instead, a heavy, irritated sigh echoed through the receiver. "I am perfectly aware of the situation, Samantha," my father said. His voice was incredibly cold, carrying that authoritative tone he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "Trayvon called me this morning to outline his operational strategy. I gave him my full approval." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "You gave him your approval, Dad?" Trevon does not speak a word of Japanese. He knows absolutely nothing about their corporate etiquette. He thinks he can just wave money around and force Mr. Takahashi to sign. He is going to ruin the biggest contract this firm has ever seen. Do not speak about your brother-in-law that way, my father snapped, his anger suddenly flaring. Trevon is a brilliant executive. He understands the modern American business landscape. He knows how to push for the bottom line. You, on the other hand, have spent the last 7 years treating this company like your own personal cultural exchange program. We indulged your little language hobby because you are my daughter, but it is time for the real executives to step in and close the deal. My chest tightened. A hobby. I had secured our expansion into the Asian market. I had brought in hundreds of millions in revenue over the past 7 years, while Stephanie was taking extended vacations and Trayvon was bouncing between failed tech startups before marrying into our family. I brought that deal to the table. I reminded him, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts. I spent countless hours earning their trust when nobody else in this building could even secure a phone call with them. You are going to let them steal my $5 million commission. You are an ungrateful, entitled child, my father fired back, his volume matching mine. You have been leeching off this family company for years. We paid your salary. We funded your ridiculous cultural degree when you refused to study finance like your sister. Every contact you made belongs to the firm. You own nothing. You deserve nothing. You should be thanking Stephanie and Trayvon for letting you play a part in this process for as long as you did. Before I could respond to the sheer audacity of his rewritten history, the sound of the phone being passed rustled through the speaker. My mother Diane came on the line. I braced myself, hoping for at least a shred of maternal mediation. I should have known better. Samantha, please stop causing such unnecessary drama, my mother said, her voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing sweetness she used to dismiss my feelings. Your sister is under a lot of stress, stepping into the chief executive officer role. She does not need you throwing a tantrum and complicating her first major victory. Her first major victory. They were truly going to hand Stephanie my life work on a silver platter and applaud her for it. Mom, I said, my throat aching with the effort to hold back tears of pure frustration. They threw me out on the street. I have no job. They froze my corporate cards. How can you defend this? Because we have to look at the bigger picture, my mother replied smoothly, entirely unaffected by my distress. Family loyalty means supporting the leadership of the firm. And speaking of the bigger picture, there is another matter we need to discuss regarding your living arrangements. A cold dread pooled in my stomach. What about my living arrangements? The luxury apartment you are currently occupying is a company asset, she stated, her tone shifting to crisp business. Since you are no longer employed by the firm, you are no longer entitled to the housing benefit. We need you to vacate the premises today. Today. I gasped, the shock finally breaking through my carefully maintained composure. Mom, you cannot be serious. All my things are there. My furniture, my clothes. I have nowhere else to go tonight. You are a grown woman, Samantha. I am sure you can figure it out, she replied breezily. Stephanie needs that space. Her daughter is starting private watercolor lessons next week with an exclusive tutor, and that apartment has the absolute best natural lighting in the city. We are converting it into a painting studio for your niece. It is much more practical for the family. I stood frozen in the middle of the lobby. The world around me seemed to tilt on its axis. My mother was kicking me out of my home, making me completely homeless by nightfall so her golden grandchild could have a room to paint pictures in. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. You are throwing your own daughter out on the street for a painting room, I whispered, the reality of their betrayal settling deep into my bones. Do not play the victim, my father shouted, having snatched the phone back from my mother. You brought this entirely on yourself with your insubordination and your complete lack of respect for your sister. Pack your personal items and leave the keys with the building manager by 5 o'clock this evening. If you cause a scene or damage any company property, I will have our legal team sue you for every penny you have saved. Do not call us again until you are ready to apologize. The line went dead. The sharp click of the disconnected call echoed in my ear. I lowered the phone, slowly staring at the blank screen. There was no more illusion. There was no more hoping that my hard work would eventually earn their respect. They had stripped me of my career, my commission, and my home in a matter of hours, all without a single ounce of hesitation. I looked down at the cardboard box resting on the marble bench. It contained everything I had left in the world. I was officially jobless. I was officially homeless. My own family had locked me out of the empire I helped build, leaving me completely out in the cold. But as the initial shock began to fade, a new fiery determination took its place. They had taken my past, but they had absolutely no idea what they had just unleashed upon their future. The sharp click of the disconnected line echoed in my ear. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the blank screen for a long moment. A normal person would have crumbled right there on the polished marble floor. A normal daughter would have broken down into hysterical sobs mourning the loss of her family, her prestigious career and her luxury home, all in the span of 30 brutal minutes. But I did not shed a single tear. The initial shock that had frozen my veins just moments ago was rapidly melting away, replaced by an absolute icy calm. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and picked up my cardboard box. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk. The intense midday heat hit me instantly, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled executive suites I had just been banished from. I turned around and looked up at the towering glass and steel monolith of my family corporate headquarters. The sunlight glinted off the highest floors, the exact place where Stephanie and Trevon were likely popping an expensive bottle of vintage champagne, celebrating their brilliant tactical maneuvering. They truly believed they had executed a flawless corporate coup. They thought they had cleanly excised the family disappointment and secured a billion-dollar prize for themselves. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that promised absolute ruin. The contrast between my current physical state and the reality of the situation was almost poetic. Here I was carrying a battered cardboard box containing a ceramic mug, a few framed photos, and a Japanese good luck charm, looking like a defeated mid-level employee who had just lost everything. Meanwhile, up in that gleaming tower, my family was cheering, completely unaware that they were celebrating their own funeral. They had always despised my deep immersion into Asian culture. My parents used to mock the hours I spent perfecting my Japanese business etiquette and mastering the intricate levels of keigo, the highly respectful honorific language used in traditional Japanese boardrooms. My father called it a useless parlor trick, but that parlor trick had secured a level of trust that their aggressive American financial degrees could never buy. They were so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need to prove their superiority that they completely ignored the fundamental rule of international mergers. You do not just buy a traditional Japanese company with loud voices and flashy bank accounts, you marry it. And in this particular marriage, I was the only bride Mr. Kenji Takahashi recognized. My mind shifted from the sting of personal betrayal to the sharp, precise calculations of corporate strategy. Trayvon and Stephanie were operating under the arrogant assumption that American business tactics translated seamlessly across the globe. They believed the letter of intent resting on that mahogany boardroom table was a binding promise of a $1.5 billion payout. They saw the massive zeros and assumed the ink was already dry. What my arrogant sister and my aggressively ignorant brother-in-law failed to understand was the intricate legal and cultural architecture of the document they were currently holding. Mr. Takahashi was a traditionalist who valued honor and personal integrity far above basic financial metrics. Over the last 2 years, I had not just translated words for him. I had demonstrated a profound understanding of his company legacy, his employee welfare concerns, and his vision for the future. Because of that deep personal trust, the preliminary agreement we established was not a standard Western contract. It was a highly specialized document drafted under Japanese corporate customs, and it contained a specific non-negotiable stipulation known as a key personnel clause. In the realm of high-stakes Japanese mergers and acquisitions, a Juyo Jinji or key personnel provision is an absolute safeguard. Mr. Takahashi had his elite legal team embed this clause explicitly to protect his lifework from the very kind of corporate raiding my family was notorious for. The clause stated in unequivocal legal terms that the entire $1.5 billion merger was strictly contingent upon my direct continuous management of the project. It legally bound the massive agreement to my presence. It dictated that any change in the core leadership of the acquisition team required my explicit written consent and a formal handover process approved personally by Mr. Takahashi. Without my signature, without my presence at the negotiating table, and without my formal endorsement, that glorious billion-dollar letter of intent was nothing more than a worthless stack of paper. It held absolutely zero legal weight. It was entirely void. My family had absolutely no idea. They had been so eager to push me out the door that they never bothered to have their own legal team properly scrutinize the Japanese clauses of the preliminary agreement. Trevon was probably sitting in my former office right now, using his $50 artificial intelligence software to scan the English summary of the document, completely oblivious to the legal landmine buried in the original text. He actually believed his loud voice and aggressive negotiating tactics would intimidate a seasoned Japanese billionaire into finalizing the deal. The sheer scale of their stupidity was breathtaking. They were about to fly across the world, check into five-star hotels, and walk into a boardroom in Tokyo expecting to be crowned corporate royalty. Instead, they were walking straight into a legal and cultural slaughterhouse, and they had personally handed me the detonator. My father thought he was punishing me by stripping away my apartment and throwing me on the street. He thought he was teaching me a lesson about loyalty and hierarchy. He wanted to break me so thoroughly that I would have no choice but to crawl back on my hands and knees, begging for a minor role in the empire he and my mother controlled. I adjusted my grip on the cardboard box. The weight of my few personal possessions felt incredibly light compared to the massive leverage I now held. Let them have the apartment. Let them have the corner office. Let them bask in their false victory for a few more days. They had taken my current livelihood, but I held the absolute power to legally obliterate their future. I turned away from the towering glass building, my posture perfectly straight. The crowded New York streets buzzed with energy, but my focus was razor sharp. I had a very short window of time to execute the next phase of this operation. I needed a temporary place to stay, a secure internet connection, and total silence to begin drafting my countermeasures. I walked down the concrete steps toward the subway station, the rhythmic rumble of the underground trains vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I pulled out my Metro card, the only piece of plastic in my wallet that had not been frozen by my vindictive parents. As I swiped the card through the turnstile and pushed my way through the metal barrier, the final pieces of my strategy clicked into place. Stephanie and Trevon wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate chess. They wanted to steal my legacy and claim my success as their own. I was going to let them cross the ocean, step into the arena, and realize too late that they did not even know the rules of the game they were playing. I was going to let them build their entire future on a foundation of sand, and then I was going to wash it all away. I stepped onto the crowded subway car, my cold smile returning as the doors slid shut. The countdown to their destruction had officially begun. I emerged from the subway station in Queens, far away from the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan. The air down here smelled of roasted nuts and exhaust fumes, a sharp contrast to the sanitized oxygen of the executive floor I had just been banished from. My immediate priority was basic survival. I needed a secure place to sleep, a reliable internet connection, and enough capital to sustain myself while I executed my counteroffensive. I walked into a brightly lit bank branch on the corner, carrying my cardboard box under one arm. I stepped up to the ATM, pulled out my personal debit card, and slid it into the machine. I requested a standard withdrawal to cover a security deposit on a short-term rental. The screen flashed a red error message indicating insufficient funds or a locked account. I frowned. I pulled out my primary credit card, a premium account I had maintained impeccably for a decade. I tried a simple cash advance. The machine rejected it instantly, displaying a notification to contact my issuing institution. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew my parents were vindictive, but freezing my independent lines of credit required a level of financial sabotage that crossed serious legal boundaries. I did not waste time staring at the machine. I marched directly into the branch and approached the customer service desk. The branch manager, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his monitor. I placed my identification on his desk and demanded a full review of my financial portfolio. He tapped his keyboard, his eyes scanning the data on his screen. A deep frown creased his forehead. He looked at me, then back at the screen, clearly uncomfortable with what he was seeing. "I am sorry, miss," he said softly, "but every single account linked to your social security number has been frozen. The directive came directly from the primary account holders of your family corporate trust." I leaned forward, planting my hands flat on his desk. "Those are my personal accounts." I stated, my voice dangerously low. "My salary was deposited there. They have no legal jurisdiction to freeze assets that do not belong to the firm." The manager swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Technically, because your personal banking profile was originally structured under the corporate umbrella account. When you were hired right out of college, the firm retains administrative override capabilities. They executed a total asset freeze exactly 1 hour ago." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. My parents had weaponized their corporate power to instantly paralyze my daily life. They wanted me stranded on the street with absolutely no resources, but I still had my ace in the hole. My grandmother had left me a substantial personal trust fund before she passed away. It was completely and entirely separate from the company. It was my untouchable safety net, heavily guarded by strict legal parameters that I assumed even my parents could not breach. "Check the independent trust fund," I instructed the manager. "The one established by my late grandmother. It operates entirely outside the corporate umbrella. Transfer $50,000 from that trust into a new, unaffiliated checking account immediately." The manager typed frantically, eager to resolve the tension radiating from my side of the desk. He pulled up the trust portfolio. Suddenly, all the color drained from his face. He stopped typing entirely. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the monitor toward me so I could see the screen. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "The balance is 0. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. $0.00. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. "That is impossible," I said, my voice sharp. "That trust contained over $2 million. It required my exclusive signature for any withdrawal." The manager pointed a shaking finger at the transaction history. "A wire transfer for the entire balance was executed at exactly 1:15 this afternoon. The authorizing signatures belong to Richard and Diane." How did they bypass my authorization? I demanded, the sheer audacity of the theft threatening to break my carefully maintained composure. "They utilized a dormant guardianship clause," the manager explained, his voice barely audible. "When the trust was originally established, you were a minor. Your parents were listed as legal custodians in the event of incapacitation or severe financial liability. They filed emergency paperwork claiming extreme financial damages against their corporation caused by your sudden termination. The transfer note attached to the withdrawal explicitly states the funds were seized for, and I quote, recovering the costs of your upbringing, education, and the financial liability you allegedly inflicted upon the firm. They had stolen my inheritance. They had weaponized a decades-old legal loophole to rob me blind, justifying their grand theft as a reimbursement for raising me. The sheer breathtaking malice of my own flesh and blood was staggering. They did not just want to fire me so Stephanie and Trayvon could claim the glory of the Japanese merger. They wanted to obliterate me, They wanted to ensure I could not afford a lawyer to fight my wrongful termination, a hotel for the night, or even a basic meal. They wanted me starving on the pavement by sunset, utterly broken and begging for their mercy. I did not scream at the bank manager. I did not throw my cardboard box across the lobby. I simply picked up my belongings and walked out into the suffocating afternoon heat. I had absolutely nothing. No cash, no credit, no home, no trust fund. But as I stood on the gritty sidewalk, I felt a heavy, familiar weight on my left wrist. I looked down at the vintage luxury timepiece my grandmother had given me when I graduated college. It was a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, a rare limited edition worth at least $30,000 on the resale market. I walked 3 blocks down the avenue until I found a high-end pawnbroker and jewelry buyer with heavy iron bars over the windows. I walked in, unclasped the watch, and placed it on the glass counter. The dealer examined it meticulously under a loupe, recognizing its pristine condition and rare craftsmanship. I walked out 20 minutes later with a thick envelope of untraceable cash. It broke my heart to lose the only physical memory of my grandmother, but I knew she would understand. She was a fierce woman who built her own fortune, and she knew that going to war required funding. Before the sun dipped below the horizon, I paid cash for a week in a dingy, unassuming motel room with peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign outside the window. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and bleach, a million miles away from the penthouse suites I usually occupied. I locked the flimsy door behind me, set my cardboard box on the sagging mattress, and pulled out my laptop. I plugged it into the wall and connected to the unsecured motel wireless network. I was completely stripped of my past, my savings, and my family. The war chest was gone, but my resolve was sharper than ever. My parents thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They forgot that I was the architect of their greatest success, and I knew exactly how to demolish the building from the inside out. I spent the first 48 hours in that miserable motel room doing what any top-tier executive would do. I fought back. I opened my laptop and sent out feelers to my network. I was a 33-year-old director who had personally generated hundreds of millions in revenue. My portfolio was immaculate. Within hours, I had 5 preliminary interviews lined up with some of the most aggressive competitor firms on Wall Street. Headhunters were practically salivating over the chance to poach me from my family enterprise. They knew my value, or so I thought. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere shifted drastically. It started with an email cancellation at 8 a.m., then a very brief, awkward phone call at 9. By noon, every single one of those 5 elite interviews had been abruptly terminated. The excuses were identical and entirely manufactured. They suddenly decided to pause hiring. They restructured the role. They were moving in a different internal direction. I did not survive 7 years in the ruthless world of corporate mergers by being naive. You do not lose 5 guaranteed executive interviews in a single morning by coincidence. Something was actively poisoning the water. I picked up my phone and dialed an old industry contact, a senior executive recruiter I had worked with for years. He ignored my first 2 calls. On the 3rd attempt, he finally picked up, his voice hushed and hurried as if speaking to me was a contagious disease. He told me I needed to stop sending out my resume. He told me I was completely radioactive. The night before, the New York Mergers and Acquisitions Association had hosted its annual black tie gala at the Plaza Hotel. It was the most exclusive networking event of the year, a room packed with every major decision-maker, managing partner, and investment tycoon in the city. I usually attended that dinner. This year, my family went without me. According to my contact, Trayvon and Stephanie had worked the room like seasoned politicians. Trayvon, wearing a bespoke tuxedo paid for by my hard work, had casually dropped my name during a conversation with the managing partners of 3 rival firms. He did not just say I was fired for performance issues. He poured a lethal dose of poison directly into my professional bloodstream. He told them I was terminated for severe ethical violations. Stephanie had played her part perfectly, sighing and shaking her head while sipping champagne. She told the top executives in New York that I had been caught leaking highly classified trade secrets to competing firms. My parents, Richard and Diane, had stood right beside them, offering performative, sorrowful nods. They told their wealthy friends that it broke their hearts to fire their own daughter, but they had to protect the integrity of the firm. They claimed I was a massive liability who nearly compromised a billion-dollar international contract with my corporate espionage. In the world of high-stakes mergers and acquisitions, confidentiality is absolute. It is the lifeblood of the entire industry. An executive accused of breaking non-disclosure agreements or leaking proprietary data is instantly dead on arrival. No compliance department will ever approve their hiring. No board of directors will ever let them near a confidential ledger. My family knew exactly what they were doing. They had assassinated my character on the biggest stage possible. They had executed a flawless, coordinated industry blacklist. The recruiter hung up on me shortly after delivering the news, advising me to look for a different career path entirely. I tossed my phone onto the cheap, scratchy bedspread of my motel room. The walls felt like they were closing in. I paced the narrow stretch of stained carpet between the bed and the door. The sheer malice of their strategy was breathtaking. They had already taken my job, my commission, my apartment, and my inheritance. They had won. Why go to such extraordinary lengths to salt the earth behind me? Why orchestrate a public execution of my professional reputation? Then the cold, ugly truth settled over me. This was never just about business. This was about absolute control. Richard and Diane knew exactly how capable I was. They knew that if I walked into a rival firm, I would immediately become their most dangerous competitor. I would use my intimate knowledge of the Asian markets to crush them. But it was deeper than just neutralizing a business threat. This was psychological warfare. My parents could not handle the fact that I had never fit their mold. They hated that I chose culture and language over their rigid financial path, yet I still became the most successful person in their building. They wanted to break my spirit completely. By blacklisting me across the entire industry, they were ensuring that my pawned cash would eventually run out. They wanted me to exhaust my resources. They wanted me applying for minimum wage retail jobs, drowning in despair until my pride finally shattered. Their ultimate goal was terrifyingly clear. They wanted to starve me out. They wanted to watch me hit absolute rock bottom so that I would have no choice but to crawl back to their sprawling estate. They pictured me falling to my knees, begging for a junior-level clerical job, apologizing for my insubordination, and admitting that I was nothing without their protection. They wanted to own me, mind, body, and soul. I stopped pacing. I stood in front of the smudged mirror above the cheap motel sink and looked at my reflection. I did not look like a woman who was about to surrender. I looked like a woman who had just been handed the ultimate permission to destroy her enemies without a single ounce of mercy. They wanted me to beg. They wanted me to crawl. They had systematically burned every bridge I had in America to ensure I could never escape their shadow. They completely forgot that my greatest asset was not in America. My leverage was sitting in a boardroom in Tokyo, utterly disgusted by the very people who thought they had just conquered the world. My family had severed my lifeline, expecting me to drown. They did not realize I had already learned how to breathe underwater. It was time to activate the one connection they could never buy, never steal, and never replicate. It was time to pull the trigger. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach, a harsh contrast to the customized leather chair I was sitting in 24 hours ago. I sat cross-legged on the sagging mattress, the springs groaning quietly beneath my weight. I reached into my bag and pulled out my personal laptop. It was an older machine, something I had purchased 5 years ago with my own cash. It was completely detached from my family corporate network. There was no company tracking software installed, no keystroke loggers, and no hidden backdoors for Stephanie or Trevon to monitor my digital footprint. I was entirely off their radar. I connected to the unsecured wireless network of the motel, immediately routing my connection through a secure virtual private network to mask my location. I opened an encrypted email client that I kept hidden behind multiple layers of password protection. I took a deep breath, forcing my mind to shift gears. I had to leave the brutal, backstabbing streets of New York behind and mentally step into the refined, hyper-respectful atmosphere of a Tokyo boardroom. I began to type, and I did not use English. I used Keigo. Keigo is the highest, most complex tier of Japanese honorific language. It is not merely a different vocabulary. It is a profound linguistic art form built entirely on extreme respect, humility, and strict hierarchical distance. It requires an absolute understanding of exactly how to lower your own status while simultaneously elevating the person you are addressing. You cannot simply plug English sentences into a $50 artificial intelligence translation application and generate flawless Keigo. A machine translates literal words. It does not translate deep cultural reverence. Trevon was completely oblivious to this fact. He actually believed business was a universal language of loud voices, aggressive handshakes, and dollar signs. He had no idea that sending a poorly translated robotic email to a Japanese billionaire was considered a massive, unforgivable insult. I addressed the email directly to a private, heavily encrypted server address. It was a secure line that Mr. Kenji Takahashi had entrusted exclusively to me during a late-night dinner in Kyoto a year ago. He had given it to me on a handwritten slip of paper, explicitly instructing me to use it only to bypass his own corporate screening protocols in the event of an absolute crisis. It was a channel reserved for emergencies of the highest order. I typed the subject line with careful precision. Project Sakura, code red. I have been forced off the board. In the body of the message, I did not whine. I did not complain about my parents cutting off my trust fund, freezing my bank accounts, or blacklisting me across the American corporate landscape. Traditional Japanese business culture heavily despises emotional outbursts, public grievances, and petty family drama. Instead, I presented the raw, unvarnished truth with surgical, professional grace. I informed Mr. Takahashi that the corporate leadership of my family firm had executed a sudden hostile internal restructuring. I explained that I had been terminated without cause and physically removed from the premises by security. I stated clearly that my family intended to proceed with the $1.5 billion merger signing tomorrow morning, led entirely by my brother-in-law and my sister. I warned him that the new leadership completely lacked the cultural competence and the historical understanding required to honor his incredible corporate legacy. Most importantly, I reminded him that I was no longer legally authorized to fulfill the key personnel clause we had personally drafted together. I closed the email with a profound apology for the sudden disruption, taking full personal responsibility for the chaos, and expressing my deepest gratitude for his mentorship and trust over the past 2 years. I reviewed the text one final time. It was culturally flawless. It conveyed absolute loyalty to him and zero loyalty to my family. I pressed send. The encrypted message vanished into the digital void, traveling thousands of miles across the globe in a fraction of a second. I closed the laptop lid slightly and stared at the flickering neon sign outside the smeared motel window. The red light pulsed in a slow, rhythmic beat against the peeling wallpaper. I had just initiated the corporate equivalent of a nuclear strike. My parents and my sister had spent the entire day systematically destroying my reputation in America. They had stolen my inheritance and thrown me into the gutter, confident that I was completely powerless. But they had forgotten that true power is not always loud. Sometimes true power is a silent, encrypted message sent from a cheap motel room in Queens. I sat in the dim light and waited. The silence in the room was deafening. I listened to the muffled sound of traffic out on the street, counting the seconds in my head. 1 minute passed, then 2. The tension in my chest was almost unbearable. If Mr. Takahashi ignored the email, I was truly dead in the water. If his executive assistants managed to intercept it, the message might be buried until Monday, which would be far too late. But I knew the man. I knew his relentless dedication to his business and his absolute disdain for corporate deception. At exactly 3 minutes after I hit send, a A sharp crystalline chime broke the heavy silence in the room. I flipped the laptop open instantly. A single new message sat in my encrypted inbox. It was directly from Mr. Takahashi. I clicked it open, my pulse hammering violently against my ribs. There were no formal greetings. There were no polite inquiries about my well-being. There was no hesitation whatsoever. There was only a single decisive sentence translated perfectly into English that completely obliterated my family's entire scheme. You have 24 hours to be in Tokyo. All expenses will be paid by me. I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas. A massive surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins. The game was no longer being played on my family-rigged American chessboard. We were moving to my territory. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed the laptop into my bag, and headed straight for the door. 14 hours later, I stepped off a first-class flight at Narita International Airport. A sleek black luxury sedan was already waiting for me directly on the tarmac. Mr. Takahashi had arranged every single detail of my arrival with the kind of flawless precision my family completely lacked. I watched the vibrant neon lights of Tokyo blur past the tinted windows of the car. I had left New York as a homeless outcast with a frozen bank account. I was arriving in Japan as a tactical architect preparing for absolute war. The car did not take me to a towering glass skyscraper or a flashy Western luxury hotel. It navigated through a maze of narrow streets before stopping in front of a modest wooden gate in a highly exclusive historic district. This was a centuries-old traditional tea house hidden far away from the loud tourist centers and corporate high-rises. It was a sanctuary built on deep silence, extreme discretion, and profound respect. Trevon, with his designer suits and his booming, arrogant voice, would never be permitted to step foot inside a place like this. I slid the heavy wooden door open and carefully removed my shoes. The calming scent of fresh tatami mats and roasted matcha filled the air, immediately grounding my racing thoughts. An attendant guided me down a quiet, dimly lit hallway to a private room overlooking a meticulously raked Zen garden. Mr. Takahashi was already seated on a silk cushion at the head of the low wooden table. At 60 years old, he exuded a quiet, terrifying authority. He wore a simple dark kimono, entirely unbothered by the flashy displays of material wealth that my parents obsessed over. He nodded once as I entered. I bowed, perfectly lowering myself to the mat with the practiced grace I had spent years perfecting. We did not speak of the weather. We did not exchange the hollow, fake pleasantries that my sister Stephanie relied on to mask her incompetence. The situation was far too severe for small talk. I opened my leather portfolio and placed a stack of physical documents on the table between us. I pushed the papers forward into his line of sight. I presented the official termination notice signed by my sister and my brother-in-law. I laid out the financial logs showing my parents Richard and Diane unlawfully draining my childhood trust fund to ensure I could not afford legal representation to fight back. Finally, I produced the internal company memos I had managed to forward to my secure server before security cut my network access. These memos detailed Trayvon explicitly bragging about buying a $50 artificial intelligence translation application to handle the $1.5 billion merger. The documents outlined their calculated strategy to blacklist my name across the entire American financial sector, so I could never warn another firm about their complete lack of ethics. Mr. Takahashi picked up the papers. He read the precise Japanese translations provided by his own trusted aides. The silence in the room grew incredibly heavy. I watched his eyes narrow as he read the arrogant words Trayvon had typed. He read how my family referred to his lifetime of technological innovation as a simple cash grab. He read how Stephanie and Trayvon planned to immediately discard the carefully negotiated employee retention programs we had spent 2 years building. I did not ask for pity. I did not shed a single tear. I sat perfectly still, projecting only absolute professional resolve. When Mr. Takahashi finished reading, he placed the documents down with deliberate slowness. The rigid control he maintained over his emotions made his anger far more intimidating than any screaming match my father had ever provoked. They consider our corporate legacy a simple transaction to be processed by a cheap machine, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. They believe they can discard the architect of our mutual trust and simply replace you with algorithms and extreme arrogance. This is not merely unprofessional, Samantha. This is a profound insult to the honor of my enterprise and a direct violation of our established agreements. I nodded once, acknowledging the severe weight of his statement. My family operates on the delusion that American capital forces everyone to bow, I replied smoothly. They do not understand that true wealth and lasting power in this country are built entirely on respect and loyalty. Mr. Takahashi reached into his robe and pulled out his phone. His face was a mask of cold fury. He did not hesitate. I will contact my legal division immediately, he stated firmly. We will issue a formal, immediate termination of the letter of intent. I will ban your family corporation from ever conducting business in the Asian market. The Sakura project with them is officially dead as of this moment. He began to dial the number for his general counsel, but I raised my hand just slightly. It was a massive, calculated risk to interrupt a man of his stature, but I desperately needed him to see the bigger, far more devastating picture. Please wait, I said, my tone even and absolute. Do not cancel the contract today. Mr. Takahashi paused, his finger hovering over the screen of his phone. He looked up at me, his dark, perceptive eyes piercing through my calm facade. Canceling the deal right now only injures their pride, I explained, leaning forward slightly to emphasize my point. If you terminate the agreement today, they will simply fly back to New York, spin a convincing lie to their shareholders about market fluctuations, and find another vulnerable company to exploit. They will face zero financial consequences for their treachery. If you truly want to punish their immense disrespect, we cannot just lock them out of the building. We have to let them walk right into the vault, smiling and celebrating, and then we lock the heavy steel door right behind them. Mr. Takahashi slowly lowered his phone to the table. The faintest trace of a dangerous, approving smile touched the corners of his mouth. He placed his hands flat on his knees, giving me his full, undivided attention. I propose we proceed exactly as they expect. I continued laying out the ruthless strategy that had kept me awake for the last 24 hours. Let Stephanie and Trevon fly to Tokyo in their first-class seats. Let them bring my parents to gloat. Let them taste the absolute certainty of the victory they stole from me. But while they are busy parading around your city spending money they do not have, we will completely restructure the legal and financial foundation of this merger right under their noses. We are going to use their own blinding arrogance against them. We are going to teach my family a devastating, inescapable lesson in international corporate law that will bankrupt their entire empire. Mr. Takahashi did not just agree to my strategy, he mobilized an absolute army to execute it. Within an hour of our meeting at the traditional tea house, I was sitting in a highly secure, soundproof conference room in the Ginza district, surrounded by 3 of his top corporate attorneys and 2 elite financial fixers. In Japan, establishing a new corporate entity usually requires mountains of red tape, endless physical paperwork, and weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering. But when a billionaire technology titan personally guarantees the capital and puts his formidable reputation on the line, doors open instantly. We worked straight through the night, fueled by strong black coffee and absolute tactical focus. By the time the sun rose over the glittering Tokyo skyline, we had entirely bypassed the usual waiting periods. We legally registered a brand new, strictly independent limited liability company. I was named the sole president and majority shareholder. My parents had frozen my bank accounts and stolen my childhood trust fund, leaving me completely penniless in New York just 2 days ago. Now I was sitting at the helm of a fully funded investment vehicle backed by a massive influx of untraceable capital straight from Mr. Takahashi Personal Holding Company. We named the new entity Vanguard Apex Holdings. It was a ghost ship designed specifically to intercept the $1.5 billion payload my family thought they had secured. The legal framework was pristine, My new company was perfectly positioned to inherit the exact terms of the Sakura project the moment my family contract inevitably imploded. Halfway across the world, my brother-in-law was busily digging his own grave. I received real-time updates from Mr. Takahashi, executive assistant, a brilliant and highly observant woman named Akiko, who was acting as the primary point of contact for my family. According to the digital communication logs, Trevon had immediately moved into my corner office and claimed my desk. He was brimming with unearned confidence. Armed with his $50 artificial intelligence translation application, he decided he was going to show the firm how a real executive negotiates. He entirely bypassed the delicate, respectful dialogue I had carefully cultivated for 2 years. Instead, he started sending aggressive, demanding emails directly to Akiko. Trevon was completely ignorant of the fact that Japanese business culture relies heavily on reading the air and maintaining deep professional harmony. He saw Mr. Takahashi's initial silence not as a warning sign of profound offense, but as a sign of weakness. Driven by his own greed and Stephanie's endless thirst for higher profit margins, Trevon took it upon himself to unilaterally alter the revenue-sharing agreements. Trevon sat in my former leather chair, convinced he was a master negotiator, and typed out aggressive demands for an additional 5% equity stake for our family firm. He completely stripped away the comprehensive severance packages and employee protection clauses I had painstakingly negotiated for the Japanese robotics engineers. He treated the $1.5 billion merger like a cheap flea market barter. He copied and pasted his harsh American corporate jargon into his cheap software, assuming the machine would perfectly convey his dominant alpha male persona. The translations that arrived in Akiko's inbox were an absolute linguistic catastrophe. The software entirely failed to process the intricate nuances of Keigo. Instead of formal business requests, Trevon emails read like aggressive, almost hostile demands from a street thug. He used informal pronouns that bordered on outright insults when addressing a 60-year-old respected billionaire. But the offensive language was only a small fraction of the weapon we were building against him. Every single time Trevon sent an email modifying the financial terms without mutual consultation, he was committing a severe breach of good faith negotiating principles. He had no idea that Akiko was forwarding every single message directly to me and the legal team in Ginza. We sat in the boardroom printing out his catastrophic emails one by one. The lawyers meticulously documented every unilateral change, every aggressive demand, and every cultural insult. We were compiling a massive, irrefutable dossier of corporate malpractice. We had him dead to rights. Trevon was actively proving in writing that the new leadership of my family firm was not only culturally incompetent, but fundamentally unethical and completely untrustworthy. To seal the trap, Akiko replied to Trevon's latest demand with a standard highly formalized phrase acknowledging receipt of his message. To anyone trained in Japanese business etiquette, her phrasing clearly meant the matter was tabled for serious internal review and extreme scrutiny. But Trevon fed her polite response into his cheap translation application. The machine spit out a literal translation that completely missed the cultural context. Trevon interpreted the polite acknowledgement as total submission. He immediately sent a triumphant email back to my parents bragging that he had successfully bullied the Japanese billionaire into accepting their new heavily skewed terms. He booked their first-class tickets to Tokyo, entirely convinced that he had manipulated the foreign partner without ever needing my linguistic skills or my cultural expertise. He believed he had won the war, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been rigged with explosives. The heavy, rhythmic hum of the laser printer in our Ginza conference room felt like the ticking of a time bomb. Akiko stood perfectly straight beside the machine, her normally composed expression fracturing into genuine horror as she collected the latest batch of revised contracts forwarded by my brother-in-law. She placed the freshly printed documents onto the massive oak table, sliding them precisely between Mr. Takahashi and myself. I picked up the top sheet, my eyes scanning the Japanese characters. For a brief second, the sheer magnitude of the linguistic catastrophe paralyzed my brain. Then I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud in the middle of a highly formal corporate setting. Trayvon had promised my parents he would secure a more aggressive, highly profitable agreement using his $50 artificial intelligence application. He had taken the intricately balanced, culturally respectful contract I had spent 2 years drafting and fed it directly into a machine. He wanted to sound like a dominant Wall Street shark. He wanted to establish that the American acquisition team was the superior force in the room. He typed out the English phrase, strategic partner for corporate assimilation. The artificial intelligence, entirely devoid of cultural context, historical nuance, or basic human respect, processed his aggressive English phrasing and spit out a literal Japanese translation. It did not use the respectful business term for an equal partner. Instead, the software selected a highly aggressive, archaic term that roughly translated to subjugated target for complete liquidation. Trayvon had officially submitted a legally binding draft document to a 60-year-old Japanese billionaire, effectively calling him a defeated subordinate whose life work was about to be scavenged for parts. In traditional Japanese corporate culture, hierarchy, honor, and mutual respect are the absolute foundations of any business relationship. An insult of this magnitude was not just a faux pas. It was a formal declaration of corporate war. But Trayvon did not stop there. Emboldened by what he perceived as Japanese submission, he continued to fire off rapid, carelessly formatted emails throughout the New York afternoon. He entirely stripped away the customary opening greetings that acknowledged the changing of the seasons and the health of the partner enterprise. He used abrupt, demanding sentence structures that commanded Mr. Takahashi to expedite his internal reviews to accommodate the American timeline. My sister Stephanie, eager to prove her new authority as chief executive officer, decided to add her own layer of sheer incompetence to the digital trail. Akiko handed me a printed email chain where Stephanie had boldly copied my parents Richard and Diane on her correspondence. Stephanie demanded that the Japanese executive team streamline their outdated, tedious signing ceremonies. She explicitly stated that the American delegation had secured reservations at several highly exclusive Michelin star restaurants in Tokyo and did not wish to waste their evening engaging in unnecessary traditional pleasantries. I looked across the table at Mr. Takahashi. He sat with his hands folded perfectly in his lap, his face completely devoid of any readable emotion. But I knew him well enough to see the cold, terrifying fire burning behind his dark eyes. He was a man who had built his artificial intelligence and robotics empire from the ground up, surviving decades of brutal economic shifts through absolute discipline. And here were two arrogant, uncultured heirs treating him like a desperate merchant at a local flea market. Mr. Takahashi did not raise his voice. He did not draft an angry response. He simply turned to his lead counsel, a brilliant and impeccably dressed lawyer named Kenjiro. Archive every single transmission. Mr. Takahashi ordered, his voice carrying the lethal weight of a falling blade. Categorize every linguistic insult, every unilateral financial alteration, and every display of gross negligence. Print them in triplicate. Secure them in the primary legal vault. Kenjiro bowed deeply, immediately executing the directive. He looked at me, a rare shark-like smile crossing his professional features. Under international business law, and specifically under Japanese corporate governance, there is a fundamental covenant of good faith and fair dealing required during the finalization of any major acquisition. Kenjiro explained, his voice low and precise. By continuously submitting deliberately offensive, aggressive, and culturally volatile revisions without any mutual consultation, your former company is actively demonstrating extreme bad faith. They are handing us the absolute, irrefutable legal justification we need to classify their behavior as a severe breach of corporate ethics. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the growing stack of printed emails. The trap was solidifying with every single keystroke Trayvon made in New York. They were providing us with the exact ammunition required to terminate their version of the Sakura project with extreme prejudice, while simultaneously validating the heavy penalty clauses I had secretly embedded in the original framework. Every arrogant demand they sent was another nail in their own coffin. To ensure they remained completely blind to their impending destruction, Akiko executed the final phase of the digital deception. She replied to the most recent batch of highly offensive machine-translated demands with a standard, perfectly polite, automated corporate response. She simply stated that their revised terms had been officially received, thoroughly documented, and added to the agenda for the final signing ceremony. Halfway across the world, inside the towering glass skyscraper, they had just banished me from my family, received a Kiko message. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how they reacted. They read the polite confirmation of receipt and took it as an absolute total surrender. Trayvon undoubtedly leaned back in my former chair, bragging to my father about how his aggressive negotiating tactics had broken the stubborn Japanese billionaire in a matter of hours. Stephanie likely poured a glass of champagne celebrating her status as the brilliant new chief executive officer who had finalized a $1.5 billion deal without needing her culturally obsessed, highly paid younger sister. They felt invincible. They were entirely convinced that they had outsmarted me, outmaneuvered the Japanese market, and secured a massive influx of wealth that would cement their legacy on Wall Street forever. Blinded by their own staggering hubris and a complete lack of global business acumen, they did the exact thing I needed them to do. They finalized their luxury travel itineraries. They instructed their personal assistants to pack their designer suits and evening gowns. They ordered the corporate travel department to book 4 first-class tickets on the next direct flight to Narita International Airport. I sat in the quiet, highly secure boardroom in Ginza, holding a printed copy of their flight confirmation that Akiko had discreetly intercepted from the global travel registry. I ran my finger over the names listed on the manifest: Richard, Diane, Stephanie, and Trayvon. They were preparing to fly across the world, perfectly confident that they were about to step into a royal coronation. They had absolutely no idea they were flying straight into a meticulously designed execution. 14 hours after their triumphant departure from New York, my family descended upon Narita International Airport like an invading royal court. They had booked the absolute highest tier of first-class travel, drinking premium vintage champagne while crossing the Pacific. Trayvon stepped off the plane wearing a brand-new custom-tailored suit, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire Asian market from the comfort of my former office. Stephanie walked right beside him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished terminal floor. She was busy recording a video for her social media followers, loudly bragging about her upcoming billion-dollar acquisition. She made sure everyone in the immediate vicinity knew she was the brilliant new chief executive officer who was about to make corporate history. Richard and Diane trailed closely behind them, acting exactly like the proud, enabling architects of this disaster. My mother adjusted her oversized sunglasses, complaining loudly about the humidity and the lack of immediate VIP transport. My father barked orders at the airline staff in rapid, condescending English, utterly refusing to acknowledge that he was a guest in a foreign country. They did not see the quiet, polite efficiency of the Japanese airport staff as a cultural standard. They saw it as submission. They were entirely convinced that their American wealth made them untouchable deities in a city they fundamentally did not understand. Their corporate luxury vehicles shuttled them directly to one of the most elite, astronomically expensive hotels in the heart of the city. Trayvon had utilized the corporate credit card, the very same account he and my parents had frozen me out of to secure the presidential suite. The nightly rate was staggering, equivalent to a modest yearly salary, but they did not care. In their minds, the $1.5 billion payout was already deposited into their bank accounts. The Sakura Project Commission was merely days away from clearing, rendering any current expenditures completely meaningless. They walked into the massive gold-accented penthouse overlooking the glittering Tokyo skyline. Stephanie immediately began ordering the hotel concierge to restock the private bar with bottles of liquor that cost thousands of dollars each. Trevon lounged on the velvet sofa, his expensive shoes propped up carelessly on a priceless antique coffee table, laughing loudly as he recounted how easily he had forced the stubborn Japanese billionaire to bow to his demands. They toasted to their own genius. They raised their crystal glasses and celebrated my removal, congratulating each other for finally cutting the dead weight from the family empire. They believed throwing me on the street was the best financial decision they had ever made. The true depth of their financial recklessness unfolded the very next morning. Fueled by greed and a profound lack of discipline, my family descended upon the Ginza district. Ginza is one of the most luxurious high-end shopping avenues on the planet, a place where fortunes can be evaporated in a matter of hours. And they intended to evaporate a massive one. Diane and Stephanie treated the corporate platinum cards like limitless magical wands. They swept through exclusive designer boutiques, purchasing rare leather handbags, diamond-encrusted jewelry, and limited-edition silk garments. Stephanie loudly justified swiping the company card for a $70,000 diamond necklace, claiming she needed to look the part of a billionaire executive for the signing ceremony. She paraded in front of the boutique mirrors, completely obsessed with her own reflection, ignoring the astronomical price tags. Trayvon was equally gluttonous. He marched into a legendary bespoke watchmaker and demanded their most expensive timepiece. When the respectful Japanese attendant tried to explain the heritage and craftsmanship of the watch, Trevin rudely cut him off, tossed the platinum card on the glass counter, and told the man to just run the payment. Richard watched approvingly, purchasing his own sets of imported golf clubs and tailored Italian suits. Within a single afternoon, my family had racked up over $400,000 in luxury expenditures. They were leveraging the absolute maximum limits of the company credit lines, completely draining the operational cash flow of the firm they were supposed to be leading. They were spending money that technically did not exist yet, entirely blinded by the illusion of their impending victory. Less than 2 miles away from their grotesque display of vanity, the atmosphere could not have been more different. I was not shopping for diamonds or drinking champagne. I was sitting in a stark, heavily secured, windowless conference room deep inside the Takahashi legal headquarters. The air was thick with the smell of black coffee and laser printer toner. My hair was tied up, my sleeves were rolled up, and my eyes were burning from staring at complex corporate statutes for 16 hours straight. I was flanked by Kenjiro and a team of 6 elite Japanese contract lawyers. We were not celebrating. We were sharpening the blade. Every single luxury purchase my family made on that corporate card was being quietly logged by the financial monitors I had left embedded in my old network. I watched the numbers tick upward on my encrypted laptop screen. Their massive debt was rapidly compounding the financial ruin they were about to face. They were willfully handing me the exact financial leverage I needed to completely destroy their corporate standing back in New York. While Stephanie and Trayvon were busy picking out outfits for the signing ceremony, I was meticulously reviewing the Japanese penal code regarding corporate fraud, bad faith negotiations, and breach of fiduciary duty. Kenjiro handed me the final draft of the termination and penalty execution protocol. It was a flawless, lethal legal document. It outlined exactly how the $200 million penalty would be triggered the exact second Mr. Takahashi rejected their forged terms. It detailed the immediate asset freeze that would hit their company the moment the breach of contract was formalized. I took a pen and initialed the final page. My family was drowning themselves in luxury, wrapping themselves in expensive silks and imported diamonds. They had absolutely no idea that just a few blocks away I was pulling the heavy, inescapable legal noose tight around their necks. Mr. Takahashi had arranged the pre-signing dinner at a highly exclusive invite-only ryote in the historic Kagurazaka district. This was a traditional restaurant with a 300-year legacy, a sacred space where prime ministers and foreign dignitaries dined in absolute privacy. The serene ambiance was defined by sliding shoji screens, priceless antique ceramics, and profound, reverent silence. That silence was violently shattered the moment my family arrived. They were 45 minutes late. Trevon kicked off his designer shoes carelessly at the entrance, knocking over a meticulously arranged seasonal floral display. He wore a loud pinstriped suit that screamed Wall Street excess. Stephanie stumbled in right behind him, complaining loudly about the humidity ruining her hair. Her wrists were heavy with the diamond bracelets she had purchased that very afternoon using the company credit line. Richard and Diane followed, looking around the minimalist, elegant room with visible disdain. They were clearly expecting a flashy Western steakhouse with crystal chandeliers and loud music, not a quiet room with tatami mats. Mr. Takahashi sat perfectly still at the head of the low wooden table, his face a mask of polite neutrality. Akiko, his executive assistant, and Kenjiro, his lead counsel, sat beside him. They bowed deeply and respectfully as my family entered the room. Trevon did not return the bow. He simply walked over, dropped his heavy frame onto the delicate silk cushion, and groaned loudly about having to sit on the floor. The master chef had prepared a customized kaiseki menu, a multi-course traditional dinner that was considered a profound honor to receive. The first course, a delicate arrangement of seasonal sashimi and sea urchin, was placed gently in front of Trevon. He took one single look at the culinary masterpiece, wrinkled his nose in pure disgust, and pushed the antique ceramic plate away. He actually waved his hand dismissively at the master chef. "I do not eat bait," Trevon announced, his booming voice echoing harshly off the paper walls. "Get me a well-done steak. If you do not have steak, order me a burger from room service. I am not putting raw fish in my mouth." Stephanie laughed, pushing her own plate aside and loudly agreeing that the texture looked absolutely repulsive. The severe cultural insult hung heavy in the air, but Mr. Takahashi simply signaled the servers to remove the plates. He did not show a single ounce of anger. Trevon took this extreme restraint as total submission. Emboldened by what he perceived as dominance, Trevon pulled out his phone and opened his cheap translation application. He held the glowing screen right up to Akiko's face, completely invading her personal space, and snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. "Tell the old man we need to skip all these tiny little dishes and get straight to the paperwork," Trevon ordered. Akiko, a highly educated executive who spoke fluent English, simply stared at him. She did not need a machine to understand his profound disrespect, but she maintained her flawless professional composure. "I understand, sir," she replied in perfect, unaccented English. "I will inform Mr. Takahashi of your preference." Trevon looked momentarily startled that she spoke English, but quickly recovered his arrogant smirk. "Good," he said, leaning back and loosening his silk tie. "Let us get down to business. I do not have all night to sit on the floor." In Japanese business culture, the pre-signing dinner is strictly for building personal harmony and mutual trust. You absolutely never discuss contract terms, financial metrics, or legal clauses over a kaiseki meal. It is considered aggressively rude and highly unprofessional. Trevon, entirely ignorant of this fundamental rule, reached into his designer briefcase and slammed a thick leather binder onto the table right next to a priceless antique tea set. He pulled out a gold-plated pen and slid the document across the low table toward Mr. Takahashi. "We have the revised terms right here," Trevon declared, tapping the paper with a heavy manicured finger. "I used my software to streamline the Japanese translation. I cut out all the fluff. The numbers are solid. My sister-in-law used to drag these things out for months with her endless cultural garbage, but we operate on a New York timeline. Sign the bottom line right now, and we can all go celebrate. We are making you a very rich man tonight." My father Richard chimed in, raising a glass of sake he had poured for himself. To a fast, profitable partnership, he cheered loudly, completely oblivious to the fact that nobody else at the table was raising a glass. "We are bringing your company into the modern era, Kenji. You should be thanking my son-in-law for finalizing this so quickly." Stephanie checked her phone, sighing with exaggerated impatience. "Trevon, hurry it up," she whined. "We booked the VIP table at that ultra-exclusive nightclub in Roppongi at 11. We are already running behind schedule, and I am not missing my bottle service because we are stuck in a wooden hut drinking hot water." Trevon nodded, pointing the gold pen directly at Mr. Takahashi's face. You heard the lady, Trevon said, flashing his bright, arrogant smile. Let us wrap this up. Sign the paper so we can get to the real party. We have millions of dollars to spend tonight, and I am ready to pop some champagne. The sheer magnitude of their vulgarity was entirely unprecedented. They had insulted the master chef. They had degraded the executive staff. They had openly mocked the culture. They had treated a revered billionaire like a desperate subordinate holding up their nightclub schedule. The silence that followed Trevon's demand was absolute and suffocating. Kenjiro, the lead counsel, slowly looked down at the violently aggressive machine-translated document Trevon had pushed across the table. He then looked up at Mr. Takahashi. The two men exchanged a single fleeting glance. It was a look of complete and utter finality. The verdict had been delivered. The execution was sealed. Mr. Takahashi did not yell. He did not throw them out of the restaurant. He simply folded his hands together, his posture perfectly rigid, and offered Trevon a smile. It was not a smile of agreement or warmth. It was a cold, razor-sharp, terrifyingly polite smile that did not reach his dark eyes. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey willingly step directly into the center of a steel trap. We will finalize all agreements at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in my corporate boardroom. Mr. Takahashi said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. Please enjoy your evening in Tokyo. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Ginza legal war room buzzed softly overhead. It was 2 a.m. in Tokyo. The grand mahogany table was buried under massive stacks of financial disclosures, breach of contract contingencies, and the final lethal acquisition paperwork for Vanguard Apex Holdings. I was meticulously reviewing the Japanese penal codes for corporate fraud with Kenjiro when my personal cell phone illuminated the glass surface of the table. An incoming video call request flashed on the screen. The caller ID displayed my mother name, Diane. I stared at the glowing device. My parents had frozen my bank accounts. They had stolen my childhood trust fund. They had thrown me out of my apartment and systematically blacklisted me across the American financial sector. They had not called to check if I was sleeping on a park bench or starving in an alleyway. They had not called out of maternal concern. I knew exactly why Diane was calling at this highly specific hour. The disastrous pre-signing dinner with Mr. Takahashi had just concluded. My family had returned to their obscenely expensive presidential suite. They were riding the absolute high of their perceived victory and the alcohol from their celebrations. My mother needed a victim. She needed to look down at her discarded daughter to truly savor the climax of her triumph. I picked up the phone. I deliberately angled the camera so that the elite Japanese legal team, the stacks of corporate documents, and the sprawling Tokyo skyline behind me were completely out of the frame. I positioned myself against a stark, unadorned white wall near the corner of the room. I wanted to give her exactly the visual she was expecting. I pressed the green accept button. The screen instantly filled with blinding, chaotic luxury. Diane was holding the phone at an angle that deliberately showcased the massive multi-level penthouse suite. The background was a disaster zone of newly acquired wealth. Dozens of luxury shopping bags from the Ginza district were piled carelessly on top of a grand piano. Empty bottles of vintage champagne littered the antique coffee tables. In the background, I could clearly see Stephanie draped over a velvet armchair, still wearing her cocktail dress, and the $70,000 diamond necklace she had illegally charged to the company. Trevon was pacing the room with his tie undone, holding a crystal glass of amber liquor, laughing loudly about how he had put the Japanese billionaire in his proper place. Diane pulled the camera back to her own face. Her cheeks were flushed with alcohol and sheer arrogance. Her hair was perfectly styled, and a massive new ruby ring sparkled on her finger. She looked at my plain white background, her eyes widening with absolute malicious delight. "Well, look who finally answered." Diane sneered, her voice thick with condescension and victory. "I was beginning to wonder if you had to sell your phone to buy your next meal." I kept my facial expression completely void of emotion. I did not offer a greeting. I did not ask how her flight was. I simply watched her gloat. I just wanted to call and give you an update from the real executives, my mother continued. She flipped the camera around to show the panoramic view of the Tokyo skyline from her penthouse window before turning it back to her smug face. We just finished dinner with your precious Mr. Takahashi, and you will be absolutely thrilled to know that your brother-in-law handled it perfectly. He did not need to bow. He did not need to speak a single word of your useless language. He took charge like a true American alpha and forced that old man to respect our terms. I listened to her rewrite reality. She actually believed that Trevon vulgar, disrespectful behavior at the traditional ryotei was a brilliant display of corporate dominance. She had absolutely no idea that their severe lack of etiquette had just handed my legal team the final piece of ammunition required to trigger a $200 million penalty. Look at us, Samantha Diane boasted, raising her glass of champagne directly to the camera lens. Look at this suite. Look at the bags. Tomorrow morning, Trevon is going to sign the paperwork and bring $1.5 billion into our family empire. He secured the biggest deal in company history in less than 48 hours. And he did it entirely without you standing in the way, slowing us down with your pathetic cultural obsession. She paused, leaning closer to the microphone. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to search my blank face for any sign of tears, jealousy, or despair. Tell me. Samantha Diane mocked, her voice dropping into a cruel theatrical whisper. What dark, miserable corner of New York are you sitting in right now? What cheap diner are you washing dishes in to pay for your rent? I hope you are watching us celebrate. I hope you realize exactly what you threw away when you decided to disrespect your sister and your family. You are nothing but an arrogant, ungrateful failure. You thought you were irreplaceable. You thought you were the only one who could close this deal. But look at you now. You are completely worthless to us. She waited for my reaction. She desperately wanted me to scream. She wanted me to beg for a loan. She wanted me to cry and apologize for my insubordination so she could laugh and hang up in my face. I looked directly into the camera lens. I did not blink. I channeled the absolute terrifying stillness I had learned from observing the most powerful corporate leaders in Japan. When I finally spoke, I did not use the hurried emotional tone of a wounded daughter. I spoke in flawless, razor-sharp English, but I perfectly mirrored the cadence, the formal pitch, and the lethal absolute authority of a high-ranking Japanese executive delivering a final decree. I will see the family at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at the signing ceremony. Diane's face froze. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second as the cold weight of my voice registered in her ears. She stared at the screen, her alcohol-soaked brain struggling to process my absolute lack of defeat. She expected a sobbing victim. She got a Terminator. You really have lost your mind, Diane scoffed, shaking her head in disgusted disbelief. You are completely delusional. Have fun washing dishes, Samantha. The screen went black. She terminated the call. I lowered the phone and placed it face down on the mahogany conference table. The white noise of the dead connection faded into the silent, highly focused atmosphere of the Ginza war room. Across the table, Kenjiro looked up from the stack of breach of contract documents. He had not understood the English words spoken on the phone, but he clearly recognized the terrifying shift in the air. I picked up my gold pen and pulled the final binding acquisition contract toward me. The trap was fully armed. The bait had been swallowed whole. My family was sleeping soundly in their penthouse, dreaming of a billion-dollar empire they would rule forever. They had exactly 7 hours left before they woke up to a nightmare they could never escape. At exactly 3 in the morning, Tokyo time, Kenjiro executed the final step of our digital ambush. He hit send on a heavily encrypted email addressed directly to Trevon. Attached to that email was the final binding draft of the acquisition contract. It was a massive digital document spanning over 200 pages of incredibly dense and highly technical Japanese corporate law. This was the exact moment where any rational, competent executive would have woken up their elite legal team. A standard Wall Street firm would have immediately deployed a fleet of bilingual attorneys to scrutinize every single comma, every single subclause, and every single financial caveat before anyone even thought about holding a pen. But Trayvon was not a competent executive. He was an arrogant, insecure man who desperately needed to prove that he was the smartest person in the room. He was also incredibly cheap when it came to operational expenditures, preferring to spend company funds on custom-tailored suits and vintage champagne rather than vital legal counsel. Across the city, high up in the presidential suite of their luxury hotel, Trayvon was nursing a glass of expensive bourbon. Stephanie was asleep in the master bedroom, surrounded by a fortress of designer shopping bags. Richard and Diane had long since retired for the night, completely trusting their son-in-law to carry them to the finish line. Trayvon sat alone at the glass dining table, his laptop illuminating his smug face in the dark room. When the email from Kenjiro arrived, Trayvon did not forward it to a legal firm in New York. He did not ask for a professional review from a local Tokyo associate. He simply downloaded the enormous file and dragged it directly into his $50 artificial intelligence translation application. He wanted all the glory for himself. He wanted to walk into the boardroom the next morning and declare that he had single-handedly finalized the $1.5 billion merger without needing any outside help. He stared at the progress bar on his screen as the machine digested the complex legal text. The artificial intelligence software was designed for basic conversational translation and simple tourist inquiries. It was fundamentally incapable of processing the lethal microscopic nuances of Japanese contract law. When the machine translated the document back into English, it completely sanitized the most dangerous sections of the agreement. It stripped away the terrifying legal weight of the corporate mandates and presented Trayvon with a smoothed-over, dangerously simplified version of the contract. Deep within the final 50 pages of the document, Kenjiro had embedded the ultimate kill switch. It was a comprehensively structured breakup fee and penalty clause. In traditional corporate mergers, a breakup fee is a standard financial penalty paid if one party backs out of the deal. However, this specific clause was tied directly to the key personnel provision that my family had so arrogantly ignored. The clause explicitly stated that if the acquiring company altered, terminated, or replaced the primary liaison officer without the express written mutual consent of Mr. Takahashi, they would immediately incur a punitive fine of $200 million. It further stipulated that this fine was payable immediately upon the formal termination of the contract by the Japanese entity. Trayvon and his software completely missed the severity of the phrasing. The artificial intelligence encountered the complex Japanese legal terminology for catastrophic financial penalty and incorrectly translated it to standard operational transition expenses. It encountered the rigid mandate for mutual written consent and softened it to basic administrative notification. Trayvon read the badly translated summary and scoffed. He saw the number 200 million and assumed it was simply a reference to the initial capital injection they were promising to deliver after the signing. He did not read the surrounding context. He did not question why the language seemed slightly disjointed. He simply scrolled past the most devastating financial landmine ever planted in a corporate contract. Then he reached the final pages containing the guarantee agreements. In order to expedite the signing process and bypass the usual waiting periods for international corporate verification, Kenjiro had included a fast-track collateral protocol. It required the acting chief operating officer to personally initial a series of protective guarantees. Trayvon saw this as a mere formality. He was so blinded by the flashing lights of a billion-dollar payday that he completely failed to realize what he was actually pledging. By initialing those specific pages, Trayvon was legally confirming that the family corporation had the liquid assets to cover any and all penalties outlined in the previous sections. More importantly, he was signing away the controlling shares of our family empire as direct collateral against any breach of contract. He was literally putting the entire company, the building in Manhattan, the operational accounts, and every single asset my parents had built over 30 years onto the chopping block. Trayvon did not hesitate. He did not wake Richard up to consult him. He just wanted to be the man who closed the deal. He activated the electronic signature tool on his laptop. With a few rapid, careless strokes of his trackpad, he digitally initialed every single page of the guarantee agreements. He locked the family equity into the Japanese legal system entirely unaware that he had just signed their death warrant. He hit the reply button, attached his digitally signed guarantees, and sent the email back to Kenjiro with a short, arrogant message confirming he was ready to execute the main contract at 9 o'clock sharp. Back in the Ginza war room, my laptop chimed. A notification popped up on the large projection screen we had been monitoring. Kenjiro opened the encrypted file and verified the digital signatures. The room fell entirely silent. We all stared at the bold, careless initials Trayvon had stamped onto the collateral agreements. The trap had just snapped shut. The steel teeth had locked directly onto their ankles. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The sheer arrogance of my brother-in-law was almost difficult to comprehend. He had just handed me the keys to the entire family kingdom completely free of charge. I looked out the window at the dark Tokyo sky, knowing that the sun was about to rise on the most spectacular corporate execution in modern history. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The legal framework was unbreakable. All that was left to do was walk into that boardroom and pull the lever. 9 o'clock in the morning arrived with blinding, magnificent sunlight piercing through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Takahashi Tower. The top-floor grand reception hall was an architectural masterpiece of modern steel and ancient Japanese cedar. Today, it was entirely transformed into a global media circus. Dozens of international financial reporters, camera crews, and economic analysts from New York to Tokyo were packed tightly behind the velvet ropes. The sheer magnitude of a $1.5 billion cross-border technology and robotics acquisition had drawn the absolute elite of the business press. The room buzzed with the low, frantic energy of camera shutters clicking and hushed rapid translations being whispered into recording devices. The atmosphere was electric thick with the anticipation of witnessing corporate history being made. The massive brass elevator chimed softly, and the polished doors slid open to reveal my family. They stepped out into the blinding flashes of the press corps, looking exactly like Hollywood celebrities arriving at a movie premiere, completely oblivious to the solemn corporate gravity of the space. Stephanie walked at the front of the formation wearing her new, outrageously expensive designer suit and the $70,000 diamond necklace she had illegally charged to the company credit line just yesterday. She paused deliberately for the cameras angling her chin and flashing a practiced, brilliant smile. She acted as though she had personally engineered the entire technological revolution they were supposedly buying, soaking in the attention that she felt was her absolute birthright. Trayvon stepped up right beside her, wearing his new bespoke Italian suit and the heavy, luxury timepiece he had aggressively demanded from the Ginza boutique. He did not walk so much as he strutted. He buttoned his jacket with a dramatic, arrogant flourish, nodding to the financial reporters from the American networks as if they were his old college friends. He exuded the toxic, overwhelming confidence of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the entire Asian continent from his hotel room. Richard and Diane brought up the rear, my parents practically glowing with smug parental vindication. My mother adjusted her imported silk scarf, leaning into my father and whispering something that made them both laugh, entirely unbothered by the strict, respectful silence demanded by Japanese corporate protocol. They made their way down the aisle toward the center of the grand reception hall, where a massive single slab of ancient yakusugi cedar served as the signing table. On one side of the table sat Mr. Kenji Takahashi. He wore a flawless, conservative dark suit. He sat with his spine perfectly straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees, entirely motionless. Beside him stood Kenjiro, his lead counsel, holding the thick, heavily bonded acquisition contract. A team of executive vice presidents stood behind them in a rigid, disciplined row. They did not smile for the cameras. They did not wave. They projected the terrifying absolute stillness of a military execution squad. Traven did not seem to notice the chilling heavy atmosphere radiating from the opposite side of the table. He practically threw himself into the leather chair directly across from Mr. Takahashi. Stephanie took the seat to his right, immediately pulling out her phone to check her reflection in the dark screen, ensuring her makeup had survived the elevator ride. Richard and Diane stood proudly behind them, squaring their shoulders and posing for the cameras that continued to flash relentlessly around the perimeter of the room. "Let us get this done," Kenji Trevon announced, his booming voice echoing loudly across the silent room. He did not use Mr. Takahashi proper title. He did not use any respectful honorifics. He spoke to a revered billionaire tech titan like they were drinking buddies at a suburban golf course. "We have a massive press conference scheduled back in New York tomorrow, and I want to make sure the ink is completely dry before we pop the champagne tonight. I streamlined the entire agreement for you last night. No more cultural red tape, just a clean, highly profitable American buyout." The translators in the room scrambled to relay his arrogant, painfully informal words to the Japanese press. A quiet ripple of absolute shock swept through the local reporters. To speak to an industry pioneer with such blatant, vulgar disrespect in front of the international media was nothing short of corporate suicide. But Trevon was entirely blind to the shifting, dangerous energy in the room. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out his heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He clicked the cap off with a loud, sharp snap that echoed in the tense silence of the hall. Kenjiro stepped forward, his face completely devoid of any readable expression, and carefully slid the thick leather-bound contract across the polished cedar table. He opened it precisely to the final signature page. It was the exact page containing the fatal, heavily masked penalty clauses Trayvon had blindly guaranteed just hours ago. Trayvon leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the ancient wood, completely disregarding all etiquette. He flashed one final triumphant grin toward the flashing cameras of the American financial press, making sure they captured his victorious angle. He lowered his hand, the gold nib of his pen hovering less than an inch above the crisp white parchment. He was a fraction of a second away from signing his name, entirely convinced he was cementing his legacy as the greatest chief operating officer in our family history. He was ready to claim his billion-dollar prize. Mr. Takahashi did not speak. He did not shift his posture. He simply raised one single hand, his palm facing outward. It was a minute, almost imperceptible gesture, but it carried the gravitational force of a collapsing star. Kenjiro immediately reached out and placed his hand flat over the signature line, physically blocking Trayvon from touching the paper with his pen. The rapid-fire clicking of the camera shutters abruptly ceased. The hushed whispers of the reporters instantly died. The entire room plunged into a sudden, suffocating, absolute silence. Trayvon froze, his gold pen suspended in mid-air, his arrogant smile faltering as confusion finally began to crack his ironclad armor of confidence. Stephanie lowered her phone, her brow furrowing in deep irritation at the sudden halt. Richard stepped forward, opening his mouth to demand a loud explanation for the unprecedented delay. Before my father could utter a single word of protest, the heavy towering oak doors at the far end of the grand reception hall burst open. The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding thud that echoed across the silent reception hall like the crack of a judge gavel. Every camera lens, every financial reporter, and every executive in the room instantly snapped their attention away from the signing table and toward the grand entrance. I stepped over the threshold, my posture perfectly straight, my heels striking the polished cedar floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm that commanded absolute, terrified attention. I was no longer the defeated, exhausted woman carrying a sad cardboard box out of a Manhattan skyscraper. I wore a bespoke midnight blue suit, tailored to absolute perfection by one of the most exclusive artisans in Tokyo. The fabric moved with lethal grace, projecting an aura of untouchable billionaire authority. I did not look like a discarded younger sister who had been begging for scraps of familial affection. I looked like an emperor arriving to claim a conquered territory. I did not walk into that massive room alone. Flanking me was a phalanx of the most feared elite corporate attorneys in Japan. They wore immaculate dark suits and carried themselves with the terrifying synchronized precision of an elite military unit. These were men who dismantled multinational conglomerates before breakfast and bankrupted corrupt executives for sport. They formed an impenetrable wall of legal power around me, their faces completely devoid of emotion, their eyes locked dead ahead. As we marched down the center aisle of the Grand Hall, the sea of international journalists parted automatically, sensing the massive, undeniable shift in corporate gravity. The flashes of 100 cameras erupted like a localized lightning storm, capturing every single second of my magnificent return. At the signing table, the color instantly drained from my family faces, leaving them looking like horrified ghosts. Stephanie dropped her phone onto the priceless cedar wood, the screen cracking loudly in the silent room. Her jaw went completely slack, her eyes bulging as she stared at the tailored suit and the intimidating entourage of lawyers surrounding me. She could not comprehend how the sister she had thrown into the gutter was currently commanding the absolute attention of the global financial press. Richard and Diane stood frozen right behind her, their arrogant, vindictive smiles melting into expressions of sheer, unadulterated panic. They had spent the last 48 hours convinced I was weeping in a cheap, bug-infested motel room. Now they were staring at a woman who radiated more wealth and raw power than their entire corporate board combined. Trayvon was the first to break the paralyzing shock. His massive, fragile ego simply refused to process the reality unfolding in front of him. He slammed his hands down on the antique table and vaulted out of his leather chair, his face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed facade. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of corporate decorum or basic human dignity. "What the hell is this?" Trayvon roared, his booming voice shattering the refined, highly disciplined atmosphere of the hall. He turned wildly toward the stoic Japanese security guards stationed around the perimeter of the room, waving his arms like a madman. "Security! Grab her right now! Get this crazy woman out of my signing ceremony! She does not work for us anymore. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to sabotage a billionaire transaction. Throw her out on the street before I call the police and press charges." He fully expected the guards to rush forward and physically drag me away, exactly like the security team he had ordered to escort me out of my own office in New York. He expected his loud, aggressive American commands to dictate the actions of everyone in the room. He truly believed his new title made him invincible. Instead, the highly trained security detail moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. But they did not move toward me. 4 broad-shouldered guards in immaculate dark uniforms stepped forward in perfect unison, placing themselves directly between Trayvon and the center of the room. They formed a solid, unyielding human barricade. When Trayvon tried to aggressively push his way past them to reach me, the lead guard smoothly raised his forearm, pressing it firmly against Trayvon's chest, stopping his forward momentum with the strength of a concrete wall. "Do not touch me!" Trayvon shouted, his voice cracking with rising panic as the guard physically forced him to take a painful step backward. "Do you know who I am? I am the Chief Operating Officer. I am about to own half this building. Get your hands off me!" I did not flinch. I did not break my stride. I walked right past my screaming brother-in-law, my trembling sister, and my horrified parents, stopping directly in front of the massive cedar table. I looked down at the forged documents they had been about to sign, then looked up and offered a deep, flawless bow of profound respect to the man sitting on the other side. Mr. Takahashi stood up. In the rigid, hierarchical world of Japanese corporate titans, a man of his immense stature does not stand for a junior executive. He does not stand for a discarded employee. By rising to his feet, Mr. Takahashi was publicly validating my absolute authority. The sudden movement sent a massive shockwave through the press corps. The journalists leaned over the velvet ropes, thrusting their recording devices forward, their cameras clicking frantically, desperate to capture the unfolding climax. Mr. Takahashi buttoned his suit jacket with calm, deliberate precision. He turned his gaze away from my hyperventilating family, completely ignoring Trayvon. Pathetic shouts, and looked directly into the blinding flashes of the international media cameras. He spoke in English, his voice carrying the deep resonant weight of absolute finality, ensuring that every single financial network on the planet would broadcast his exact words. There has been a severe misunderstanding regarding the leadership of this transaction. Mr. Takahashi announced the utter silence in the room, amplifying his terrifyingly calm tone. The individuals currently seated at this table do not possess the cultural integrity, the professional ethics, or the required legal authorization to execute the Sakura project. He gestured gracefully toward me, leveling his dark, penetrating eyes at the cameras. "This is Samantha," he declared, sealing my family fate with one single devastating sentence. "And she is the only representative partner I acknowledge." A collective deafening gasp rippled through the press corps. The cameras pivoted wildly, flashing bright white light onto my perfectly tailored suit. I turned my head just slightly to look at my family. Stephanie was clutching her $70,000 diamond necklace, her mouth hanging wide open in an ugly, silent scream of sheer terror. Diane clutched Richard's arm, both of them literally shaking as they stared at the catastrophic ruins of their billion-dollar delusion. Trayvon stood trapped behind the wall of security guards, his arrogant facade completely shattered, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that he had not just lost the deal. He had lost everything. The deafening noise of the press corps reached a fever pitch as Mr. Takahashi stepped back, leaving the floor entirely to his lead counsel. Kenjiro stepped forward with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner. He held the massive leather-bound acquisition contract in his hands. He raised the document high enough for the flashing cameras to capture the gold-embossed crest on the cover. Then, with a sudden, violent downward motion, Kenjiro slammed the heavy binder directly onto the center of the ancient cedar table. The sharp, explosive crack echoed through the grand reception hall like a gunshot, instantly silencing the frantic whispers of the international journalists. Trayvon jumped, his arrogant posture finally crumbling as he stared at the heavy book. Stephanie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. Richard and Diane stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats as they realized the ceremonial atmosphere had violently shifted into a legal tribunal. Kenjiro adjusted his glasses and looked directly into the bank of television cameras. He spoke in flawless, razor-sharp English, his voice carrying absolute, terrifying authority. Effective immediately, the Takahashi Corporation is executing a hostile termination of all agreements, preliminary contracts, and letters of intent, previously established with your corporate entity. Kenjiro declared, his words striking my family like physical blows. This termination is being executed with extreme prejudice due to multiple catastrophic breaches of international corporate law and severe violations of fundamental business ethics. Trayvon practically choked on his own breath. He gripped the edge of the table and leaned forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You cannot do that!" Trayvon shouted, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the global media. "We own the company. We have the capital. We are ready to sign right now. You cannot walk away from a $1.5 billion deal just because we fired a single mid-level director." Kenjiro did not even blink. He looked at Trayvon with a level of disgust usually reserved for a cockroach. "You did not fire a mid-level director!" Kenjiro corrected, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "You illegally removed the primary liaison officer, bound by the key personnel provision. That specific clause mandated that any change in leadership required the explicit written mutual consent of Mr. Takahashi. By stripping Samantha of her authority without our legal approval, you unilaterally destroyed the foundational trust of this merger. Your contract is officially void." My father Richard pushed his way past the security guards. his face pale with rising panic. "This is a simple administrative misunderstanding," Richard pleaded, holding his hands up toward the flashing cameras in a desperate attempt at damage control. "We can reinstate her. We can negotiate a new compensation package right now. We apologize for the oversight." Kenjiro ignored my father completely. He signaled to Akiko, who immediately stepped forward, carrying a stack of sleek black presentation folders. She began handing them directly to the front row of financial journalists. The reporters eagerly ripped the folders open, their eyes scanning the documents inside. "The violation of the key personnel clause is only the beginning of your corporate malpractice," Kenjiro announced, turning his gaze back to Trayvon. "Over the past 48 hours, the acting chief operating officer of your firm engaged in a series of highly aggressive, unauthorized negotiations. To execute these negotiations, he utilized a generic commercial artificial intelligence translation application, refusing to retain competent legal counsel." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the Japanese press corps. In their culture, relying on a cheap machine to handle $1 billion legal document was a display of unimaginable disrespect. The American reporters started typing furiously into their tablets, instantly realizing that my family had just committed the most embarrassing corporate blunder of the decade. Kenjiro pulled a single sheet of paper from his own folder. He held it up for the room to see. Instead of utilizing the respectful business terminology required for a merger of equals, your chief operating officer officially submitted a legally binding draft referring to the Takahashi Corporation as a subjugated target for complete liquidation. Furthermore, your chief executive officer Kenjiro said, glaring directly at Stephanie, submitted written demands to bypass all traditional signing ceremonies so she could secure bottle service at a local nightclub. The humiliation was absolute and total. Stephanie covered her face with her hands, desperately trying to hide from the blinding camera flashes. Her $70,000 diamond necklace suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating chain. Diane stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the wall as the reporters loudly translated the horrific insults into their microphones. Trayvon stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He had been publicly exposed not as a brilliant Wall Street shark, but as an arrogant, uncultured fool who had just insulted one of the most powerful men in Asia on global television. But Kenjiro was not finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the final fatal document. It was the guarantee agreement Trevin had digitally signed at 3 a.m. "Because of your severe breach of good faith and your gross negligence in international communication, we are activating the protective measures embedded within the final contract draft." Kenjiro stated, his voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the room like a scalpel. "Last night you digitally initialed the collateral agreements binding your entire corporate portfolio to our penalty protocols." Trayvon shook his head wildly, panic fully consuming him. "No," Trayvon stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the paper. "I read that section. My software translated it. Those were standard operational transition expenses. It was just a formality." Kenjiro slammed his hand flat against the cedar table, the sudden noise making Trayvon flinch violently. "Ignorance of international law and reliance on a $50 machine does not invalidate a legally binding corporate signature," Kenjiro roared, stripping away his polite facade to reveal the ruthless legal predator underneath. "You did not sign for transition expenses. You signed the breakup fee authorization." Kenjiro turned back to the cameras, delivering the killing blow with terrifying clarity. "By violating the key personnel clause and terminating the contract through bad faith negotiations, your firm has triggered an immediate, non-negotiable punitive penalty. You owe the Takahashi Corporation $200 million, and this fee is payable immediately." The financial reporters literally shouted in shock. $200 million. It was a financial death sentence. My family did not have $200 million in liquid capital. They had just drained their operational cash flow buying luxury watches and diamond necklaces in Ginza. Kenjiro lifted the final page of the document, showing Trayvon's digital signature stamped clearly at the bottom. To guarantee this penalty, you personally pledge the controlling shares of your family empire. Your Manhattan headquarters, your operational accounts, and every single corporate asset you own are now legally frozen and held as collateral. If the $200 million is not wired into our accounts by the close of business today, we will seize your entire company and liquidate it for parts. The absolute reality of the devastation finally crashed down upon them. Richard grabbed his chest, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray, as he realized his 30-year legacy had just been wiped out in a matter of seconds. Diane let out a sharp, breathless sob, realizing the luxury lifestyle she cherished was entirely gone. Stephanie sank to her knees right there on the polished cedar floor, the heavy weight of her impending bankruptcy crushing the breath from her lungs. Traven stood trapped behind the security guards, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. He had wanted to prove he was the smartest man in the room. He had wanted to steal my glory. Instead, he had personally signed the execution order that burned his entire family empire to the ground. The heavy silence in the grand reception hall was broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of my family. Richard clutched his chest, his face completely devoid of color. Diane slumped against the cedar-paneled wall, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her entire life of luxury had just evaporated. Stephanie remained on her knees staring at the polished floor as if hoping it would open up and swallow her whole. The $200 million penalty was a financial guillotine, and the blade had just severed their empire from its foundation. Mr. Takahashi did not spare them a single glance of pity. He turned his attention entirely to me. He extended his right hand, gesturing gracefully toward the empty leather chair at the center of the massive cedar table. It was the exact seat Trevon had occupied just moments ago, the seat of the lead negotiator. "Please, Samantha," Mr. Takahashi said, his voice carrying the warmth and profound respect that my own father had never offered me. "Take your rightful place." I walked forward, my steps measured and perfectly calm. The sea of international journalists parted further, their camera lenses tracking my every move. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my sister. I walked past their shattered, trembling figures and took my seat at the head of the table. The leather was still warm from Trevon, a petty detail that made my victory feel incredibly tactile. I sat with my spine perfectly straight, mirroring the impeccable posture of the billionaire sitting across from me. Kenjiro stepped forward again, signaling to Akiko. She smoothly removed the voided catastrophic contract my family had tried to force upon them and replaced it with a brand new, pristine leather-bound folio. The gold crest on this binder was different. It did not bear the logo of my family firm. Kenjiro turned to address the global financial press corps. The Takahashi Corporation values integrity, cultural fluency, and absolute trust above all financial metrics, he announced, his voice projecting clearly across the vast room. When those core values were violated, we acted swiftly to protect our legacy. However, we do not halt progress because of the failures of incompetent individuals. We adapt and we align ourselves with true visionary leadership. Kenjiro opened the pristine folio, revealing crisp, flawless legal documents printed in both English and Japanese. Today, we are incredibly proud to announce the formation of a new exclusive strategic partnership, Kenjiro continued. The Takahashi Corporation is officially executing a $1.5 billion acquisition and joint venture with Vanguard Apex Holdings. This independent investment vehicle was established entirely under the jurisdiction of Japanese corporate law, completely free from the toxic, unethical interference of the previous negotiating party. The journalists began to murmur, their pens flying across their notepads. Kenjiro raised his hand, commanding absolute silence for the final devastating revelation. Vanguard Apex Holdings is an elite, culturally integrated firm, Kenjiro declared, and it operates under the sole ownership, direction, and absolute authority of its president and majority shareholder, Samantha. The reception hall absolutely erupted. The reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic wave of sheer financial shock. The cameras flashed so rapidly, the room felt like it was caught in a lightning storm. They had just witnessed a corporate bloodbath and a miraculous resurrection in the span of 10 minutes. The discarded blacklisted liaison officer had not just survived a hostile termination. She had completely outmaneuvered a massive American corporation, secured her own independent funding, and stolen the billion-dollar prize right out of their hands. I reached into the inner pocket of my bespoke suit jacket. I did not use a flashy gold-plated pen like Trayvon. I pulled out a simple, elegant fountain pen made of dark bamboo. It was the exact pen Mr. Takahashi had gifted me 2 years ago when we first began discussing our shared vision for the future of his company. I uncapped it smoothly, my hands completely steady. I looked across the table at Mr. Takahashi. He nodded once, a gesture of profound mutual respect and genuine partnership. I lowered the pen to the heavy parchment. With deliberate flowing strokes, I signed my name to the master agreement. I signed away my family false legacy and cemented my own empire. I pushed the document across the cedar table. Mr. Takahashi took his own pen and signed his name directly beside mine, officially binding our companies together. The deal was done. The $1.5 billion contract was legally, irrefutably mine. A primal, guttural scream ripped through the air. Trayvon completely lost his mind. The absolute realization of his total failure fractured his sanity. He had been fired, he owed $200 million, his family business was collateral, and he had just watched me conquer the very summit he had tried to steal. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation short-circuited his brain. "You stole it from me!" Trayvon roared, his voice cracking with feral, unhinged rage. "You filthy, scheming thief! I will kill you!" He lunged forward with explosive violence. He threw his massive weight against the velvet ropes, charging directly at the cedar table with his fists clenched, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He intended to physically assault me right there in front of the global media. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table. The elite security detail reacted with terrifying speed. Before Trayvon could even cross half the distance to my chair, the lead guard intercepted him. The guard pivoted sharply, grabbing Trayvon's extended arm and twisting his momentum entirely against him. With a brutal, synchronized sweep, 2 more guards slammed into Trayvon midsection. They drove him hard into the polished cedar floor. The impact echoed with a sickening thud, immediately knocking the wind out of his lungs. "Get off me!" Trayvon gasped, struggling violently against the guards pinning him down. "Do you know who I am? I am the chief operating officer. Let me go." "You are a trespasser," Kenjiro stated coldly, looking down at the thrashing man. "Remove him from the premises immediately. If he resists, contact the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and press formal assault charges." The guards did not hesitate. They hauled Trayvon up by his arms, his expensive Italian suit tearing at the shoulder seam. He kicked and screamed, hurling desperate obscenities as they dragged him forcefully backward down the center aisle of the grand hall. The international journalists eagerly snapped photos of the ruined executive being manhandled toward the brass elevators, permanently cementing his total disgrace on the front pages of every financial publication in the world. Richard, Diane, and Stephanie did not move a single muscle to help him. They stood completely paralyzed, their faces frozen in masks of utter hopeless horror. They watched the man they had trusted to elevate their empire get dragged away like a common criminal. They watched the daughter they had thrown into the gutter sit calmly at the head of a billion-dollar table. They had nothing left, no money, no leverage, no dignity. They were completely and utterly destroyed. The fallout was instantaneous and absolutely merciless. The global financial markets operate on a ruthless cycle of information, and the news of the spectacular corporate implosion in Tokyo hit Wall Street before my family even managed to stumble out of the Takahashi Tower. The live broadcast of Kenjiro executing the $200 million penalty clause sent an immediate apocalyptic shockwave through the trading floors in New York. Financial analysts and algorithmic trading bots processed the catastrophic failure in real time. Within exactly 2 hours of the press conference, concluding the stock price of my family enterprise plummeted by a staggering 80%. Decades of carefully curated corporate reputation and billions of dollars in market capitalization were completely eradicated in the span of a single morning. My encrypted laptop screen lit up with real-time alerts confirming the absolute financial slaughter. The massive penalty fee had instantly triggered an automatic freeze on all their operational accounts and credit lines. Their corporate empire was bleeding out on the trading floor, and the sharks were already circling. Back in Manhattan, the board of directors convened an emergency crisis meeting. They did not wait for my parents to board a flight. They did not ask for a strategic explanation. The board members watched the footage of Trayvon violently attacking me and screaming obscenities in front of the International Press Corps. They saw Stephanie frozen in sheer incompetence while their company was legally seized as collateral. Panic and self-preservation overrode any lingering loyalty to the founding family. The board executed a unanimous vote of no confidence. Stephanie was standing on the crowded Tokyo sidewalk outside the Takahashi building when her phone began vibrating relentlessly. I watched from the glass walls of the executive lounge high above as she answered the call from the lead board member. Even from a distance, I could envision the exact moment her entire reality shattered. The board informed her that she was stripped of her chief executive officer title effective immediately. They formally terminated Trayvon from his position as chief operating officer. The board explicitly stated that they were launching a full internal investigation into their gross negligence and cultural malpractice to shield the remaining shareholders from the collateral damage. Stephanie dropped her phone onto the concrete pavement. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely stand upright. The toxic foundation of their arrogant alliance instantly fractured under the crushing weight of a $200 million debt. Trayvon, who had been forcefully ejected from the building and dumped onto the street by security, was waiting for them. He was missing his suit jacket, his designer shirt was torn, and his monumental ego was entirely broken. When Stephanie delivered the news of their termination, the fragile illusion of their elite power couple status violently exploded. Trayvon did not offer comfort. He did not strategize a defense. He immediately turned into a cornered, vicious animal. He pointed his finger directly at Stephanie's face and began screaming at her right there on the crowded Japanese street. He blamed her for everything. He yelled that she was the one who wanted to fire me. He claimed she was the one who pushed him to use the cheap artificial intelligence translation software to save operational costs. He desperately tried to rewrite history, casting himself as an innocent victim of her corporate greed. "I am not going down for your incompetence," Trayvon roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You and your parents dragged me into this mess. You handed me that fraudulent contract. I am not letting the Japanese legal system seize my personal assets to pay for a $200 million penalty that you triggered. I am calling my lawyers right now. I am filing for divorce today. I am entirely severing myself from this bankrupt family before I end up in a federal prison." Stephanie gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. She screamed back at him, calling him a coward and a traitor. The two of them stood on the pavement viciously tearing each other apart, hurling toxic insults and blaming one another for the monumental failure they had engineered together. Their marriage, built entirely on shallow ambition and shared arrogance, dissolved into absolute hatred the second the money disappeared. Trayvon hailed a passing taxi, shoved his way inside, and sped off toward the airport, leaving his wife weeping hysterically on the sidewalk. Richard and Diane watched their golden family completely disintegrate before their eyes. My parents were utterly paralyzed by the rapid succession of catastrophic blows. They had lost their company, they had lost their fortune, and they had just watched their favored son-in-law abandon their daughter in a foreign country. Desperate to escape the public humiliation and formulate some kind of survival plan, Richard grabbed Diane by the arm and hailed another cab. They needed the safety and comfort of their elite presidential suite to process the nightmare. They arrived at the ultra-exclusive hotel, pulling their coats tight against the chilling realization of their ruin. They marched straight to the VIP elevators and swiped their corporate keycards. The light flashed solid red, access denied. Richard frowned, muttering curses under his breath, and tried again. Red. A team of pristine hotel management staff flanked by discreet security personnel approached my parents in the lavish lobby. The general manager offered a tight, perfectly polite bow that lacked any genuine warmth. He informed my father that the corporate platinum cards placed on file for the presidential suite had been aggressively declined by the issuing bank. The financial freeze initiated by the breach of contract penalty had instantly voided all of their luxury credit lines. My father demanded they run the cards again, shouting that he was a wealthy American executive. The manager calmly explained that the accounts were entirely frozen and the hotel required immediate alternative payment for the accumulating charges, including the thousands of dollars they had spent on vintage champagne the previous night. Richard and Diane stared at the manager in absolute horror. Their personal bank accounts were tethered to the corporate trust, which was now legally locked down as collateral for the Takahashi penalty. They did not have a single working credit card. They did not have the cash to pay for a single night in a standard room, let alone a presidential suite. The hotel staff moved with ruthless efficiency. They informed my parents that their belongings had already been packed by housekeeping and brought down to the ground floor. The manager politely but firmly ordered them to vacate the premises immediately to avoid trespassing charges. Richard and Diane, the proud architects of my professional execution, were unceremoniously escorted to the lobby waiting area. Their designer luggage was piled carelessly at their feet. My mother sank into a rigid lobby chair, clutching her purse with white knuckles, her face drained of all color. My father stood beside the luggage cart, staring blankly at the revolving glass doors, completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. They were stranded in a foreign city, entirely penniless, exiled from their luxury suite, and reduced to sitting in a public lobby, waiting for a miracle that was never going to come. The Vanguard Apex Holdings executive suite occupied the entire top floor of a pristine glass monolith in the Marunouchi district. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, sipping a cup of artisanal green tea, looking down at the sprawling neon-lit arteries of Tokyo. My bespoke suit fit perfectly, matching the absolute order and control I now commanded over my own life. Behind me, my massive mahogany desk was clear of any clutter save for a single pristine folder containing the finalized $1.5 billion joint venture contract. I was no longer the scapegoat of a toxic family. I was the architect of my own billionaire empire. The intercom on my desk chimed with a soft, polite tone. Akiko, who had officially transitioned to my firm as my chief of staff, spoke with crisp professionalism. She informed me that 2 American nationals were currently causing a disturbance in the ground floor lobby. They had been sitting on the visitor couches for 6 hours, refusing to leave until they spoke with the president of Vanguard Apex. They had no appointments, no corporate credentials, and no means to pay for a hotel. They were begging for 5 minutes of my time. I placed my teacup on the coaster. "Send them up," I instructed. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office slid open quietly. Richard and Diane stumbled into the room. The sight of my parents was a jarring, pathetic contrast to the arrogant, untouchable executives who had fired me just a few days ago. They were entirely broken. The tailored Italian suit my father had flaunted at the signing ceremony was deeply wrinkled, smelling faintly of stale airport coffee and despair. My mother looked completely hollowed out. Her hair, usually sprayed into a flawless helmet of suburban wealth, was flat and stringy. She was clutching a cheap plastic shopping bag instead of her designer purse, likely having sold her luxury accessories to survive the weekend after their corporate cards were aggressively declined. They stopped in the center of the expansive room, staring at the sheer, undeniable magnitude of my success. They looked at the priceless artwork on the walls, the panoramic view of the city, and finally at me. I did not stand up to greet them. I remained seated in my high-backed leather chair, my hands folded neatly on the desk, projecting the cold, terrifying stillness I had learned from Mr. Takahashi. "Samantha," my mother gasped, her voice cracking with sheer desperation as she took a trembling step forward. "Please, you have to help us. The board of directors has completely locked us out of the building. The banks in New York are moving to seize the family estate. They are foreclosing on our home this very afternoon to cover the initial margin calls from the penalty. We have absolutely nothing left." My father, a man who had spent his entire life demanding total submission from everyone around him, suddenly collapsed. His knees hit the plush carpet with a heavy thud. He was actually kneeling in front of my desk. Diane immediately dropped down right beside him, her hands clasping together in a pathetic, pleading gesture. The people who had thrown me onto the street without a single ounce of mercy were now groveling on my floor, shedding real, terrified tears. "You have to speak to Mr. Takahashi," Richard begged, his voice stripped of all its former booming authority. "He will listen to you. Tell him to waive the $200 million breakup fee. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Or just give us a loan. You have the $1.5 billion contract now. You have unlimited capital. Just give us enough to save the house and pay off the immediate corporate debts. We are your parents. You cannot just let us be thrown into the street." I looked down at them, feeling absolutely nothing, no anger, no sadness, no lingering desire for their approval. The emotional chains they had wrapped around my neck for 33 years were entirely shattered. I slowly reached into the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out a crisp, heavy stock envelope bearing the gold-embossed crest of Vanguard Apex Holdings. I placed it on the smooth surface of the mahogany desk and used 2 fingers to slide it precisely across the wood until it stopped right in front of their kneeling figures. Richard's hands shook violently as he reached up and snatched the envelope. He tore it open, his eyes wide, with the desperate, greedy hope of a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. He pulled out a certified bank check. Diane leaned over his shoulder, her tear-stained face brightening for a fraction of a second. Then they read the exact numbers printed on the paper. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. "What is this?" my father whispered, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "This is not enough to cover the estate. This is not even a fraction of the corporate debt." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, and locked my gaze directly onto his terrified eyes. "That is a certified check, refunding the exact amount of the childhood trust fund you illegally drained from my accounts," I stated, my voice dangerously soft and completely devoid of warmth. "I calculated it down to the exact dollar you stole to punish me for my supposed insubordination. I am returning the money you claimed as reimbursement for raising me. You will not receive a single penny more." My mother let out a horrific, guttural sob, dropping her face into her hands. "You are condemning us to poverty," she wailed, rocking back and forth on the carpet. "You are destroying your own family over a business deal." I stood up slowly, my presence commanding the entire room. I looked down at the 2 miserable, toxic people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "You were both entirely convinced that my cultural expertise was a useless hobby," I said, delivering the final lethal verdict with absolute clarity. "You told me that a $50 piece of technology could easily replace a dedicated liaison. You were right about one thing. Technology can absolutely replace a basic translator. But there is no software, no algorithm, and no amount of American corporate arrogance that can ever replace class, profound respect, and absolute loyalty." I picked up my briefcase and walked around the desk, stopping just inches from where they kneeled. "This company did not go bankrupt because of my actions," I continued, my voice echoing sharply in the pristine office. "This company was destroyed entirely by your own blinding arrogance. You made your choices. Now you get to live in the ruins of the empire you burned down." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on my weeping parents and walked straight toward the heavy glass doors. Akiko was waiting in the hallway, holding the elevator open for me. As the brass doors slid shut, sealing away the pathetic sounds of their desperate sobbing, I felt a massive, permanent weight lift from my shoulders. I stepped out of the lobby and into the brilliant Tokyo sunlight. A pristine, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom was idling silently at the curb. The driver immediately opened the rear door, bowing deeply as I approached. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke suit. The car pulled away from the curb, smoothly merging into the vibrant flow of the city traffic, heading straight for the private aviation terminal at Haneda Airport. My private jet was already fueled and waiting on the tarmac, ready to carry me back to the United States. But this time, I was not returning as an undervalued employee, desperately seeking validation from a toxic family. I was returning as a conquering titan, completely untethered from my past, flying back to build an unstoppable legacy. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, leaned back against the plush headrest, and watched the clouds part outside the window, finally enjoying the absolute, unshakable freedom of my new empire. The most profound lesson we can extract from this story is that your true value is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it. For years, the protagonist allowed her toxic family to diminish her accomplishments, treating her deep cultural expertise and relentless hard work as something entirely disposable. They arrogantly believed that loud demands, flashy corporate titles, and cheap technological shortcuts could effortlessly replace genuine respect and dedicated relationship building. However, their spectacular downfall proves a universal truth. Arrogance is incredibly loud, but true power is always silent, calculated, and strategic. When you find yourself trapped in an environment that constantly undermines your self-worth, whether in a high-stakes corporate boardroom or at your own family dinner table, the most effective response is not to scream for validation. The ultimate victory is having the unwavering courage to quietly secure your boundaries and walk away. You do not need to actively seek revenge when you can simply step aside and allow toxic individuals to be dismantled by their own sheer incompetence and blinding hubris. Expertise, integrity, and emotional intelligence are rare, irreplaceable assets that no machine or inherited wealth can ever duplicate. When you finally stop shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that refuse to respect you, you open the door to building your own independent empire. She did not just survive a brutal betrayal, she thrived because she recognized that her unique skills were the actual foundation of the massive deal. She reclaimed her life the absolute moment she stopped seeking their approval. If you have ever been underestimated by those who were supposed to support you, let this be your sign to stop shrinking and start building your own table. Share your story in the comments below and tell us how you found the strength to walk away from a toxic environment.